We
Miracle.
got it? We
Sorry.
got it?
Yes.
We're all on a learning curve.
Okay. Folks, don't take this personally. First of all, good morning, good afternoon to all, and I'm very delighted to see all of you here. I'm going to mute all of you. Don't take that personally. That's the reason I've wanted to host, because that gives me a lot of power. The reason is that, and you may notice that on Zoom, there's something called chat. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, if you have questions, post them on chat, because if people, it's just too large a group to be able to recognize people who want to ask questions, but I want to be able to answer your questions. So just post them, and I have it open, so I will see any question that comes up. Okay, you are able to, if you really need to speak, you're able to unmute yourself individually, but there'll be far fewer distractions if we all stay muted unless necessary. Okay. So I want to thank Rabbi Walker for being the techie amongst us who has enabled us to carry on this and all of our other programs that we're doing online. And I'm delighted that this group keeps growing. I mean, I got on 5 minutes ago, there were 20, now we're at 39. And it's very exciting to see the very fast growth of the people participating in this class. So,
Rabbi, you're a rock star.
So I want to begin with a few comments. Basically, I have 2 sessions preceding Pesach, today and a week from today. So next week, I anticipate that I will be taking a few textual parts of the Haggadah, but I'm not going to do that much of that today, because I want to just deal with the overall challenge of Passover under these very difficult circumstances. I spoke to a 95-year-old congregant on Sunday, who, thank God, is fine, but who commented to me that in her 95 years of life, this is totally new for her. Never experienced anything like this. You know, I felt the same through 66 years, but 95 is more of an authentication of how unique this circumstance is, and not, certainly not for the better, but the difference being that we have this ability, at least, to connect electronically, if not physically, over the next while. Hopefully not too long a while, but who knows. So this is a very, in a sense it's unique, but in a sense it's not unique. And I want to focus a bit on that in my opening remarks. The first thing I want to say is that virtually all of us are not going to have the Pesach we would want. I think that's a universal situation. We're not going to have the seders that we want. We're not going to have all the people there that we want. We're not going to have our children or grandchildren there in most cases, who otherwise would be there. So it's really going to be, in a sense, a very difficult Pesach on a personal level. And so what I want to comment is the note that I wrote myself was to start off by saying no guilt. Don't feel bad that you're not going to be able to do what you would want to do. We're all going to be cutting corners here and there, because that's what life has thrust upon us. Even doing Passover shopping is a huge challenge that one could never have imagined in recent times, where we have all these wonderful facilities and supermarkets, but everything now is difficult. So it's not going to be what we would want. So what I want to suggest is, I'm not really making halachic pronouncements, but I am saying that certainly if you are comfortable using technology on Shabbat, I mean, we're not doing it on behalf of the shul, but if you're comfortable using technology on Shabbat or Yom Tov, go for it. Like, bring your kids on FaceTime, on Skype, on Zoom, and share parts or all of the Seder together if you can. Use the tools you have. Even if you're a very strong traditionalist and normally would not have a computer on the Seder table or an iPad or whatever else you're going to use, if that's going to help bring family together, I would say go for it. And as a matter of fact, one of the Israeli chief rabbis, who I usually don't quote as a source, did tell Israelis, again, ultra-Orthodox Israelis, to leave your phones on over Shabbat and Yom Tov, because there might be important health advisories that you have to be able to hear. Reminding me of when I was in Israel during the Gulf War a long time ago. I think it's 1990, so we're looking at, my God, like 30 years ago. The word out then was Israelis were told by the rabbinate, leave your television on over Shabbat, because you had to be able to hear emergency sirens and announcements about when you had to go into a sealed room, and you couldn't not hear that. It was more important that you preserve life, save lives, preserve your health, rather than being fully strict on observing the laws of Shabbat. So in a sense, we're in a very similar kind of situation. Part of it is, is physical and safety. There's never a question. You do what you got to do. But here it is another level. It's also kind of spiritual safety. You have to have some kind of measure of comfort. A lot of grandparents are going to be distraught because your grandchildren are not going to be at the table, or your kids aren't going to be there. Family's not going to be there. You normally have a seder of 40 and you're down to a seder of 2 or 4. So use technology, if you can, to bring people together. It's not perfect, just like this class is. I'd love to be around a large table with all of you. Can I know 43 people would be a very large table, but this is a lot better than nothing. In other words, we still can be together. So use technology. Do not feel any guilt for not being able to do the perfect Pesach. If you are not in a situation whereby you can bring out all of the Passover dishes, you probably need fewer because you're not going to have the same number of people. Do what you can do. Don't feel guilty for not doing what you can't do. Do what you can do. Take care, be healthy, be safe, and that's the primary consideration. It's not going to come down to this, I don't think, for any of us, thank God. But there was a tefillah, a prayer that was composed in one of the camps during the Shoah, which was a special prayer for making the bracha of matzah over bread, where matzah, of course, was unattainable. And it just imagined that such a prayer was composed by a rabbi, so people would not feel the great pain, to assuage some of the pain and guilt for having to eat bread on Passover, which is a cardinal violation of Torah. But over what takes precedence, of course, is the command to preserve life. So thank God we're not there, but there'll be some shortcuts we'll have to take in order to get through this Yom Tov and feel no guilt. In other words, do what you got to do. And this will be a story that you will recount years from now, God willing, telling your grandchildren who may be too young now, or maybe some of your cases great-grandchildren who are too young to really be cognizant of what's going on, telling them what was Pesach like in 5780 in 2020. That will be a memory that will be carried. God willing, next year it'll be normal. There'll be a baseball season. There'll be a basketball season. There'll be a hockey season. There'll be Olympics, which I couldn't care less about, but there'll be all these things that will happen a year from now, if not now, God willing. And this will be a story to tell. But while we're going through it, do what you can. Don't feel guilty for not doing more than you can. I want to, part of what we're dealing with is change. And this will be a Haggadah text that I will just take you to very quickly. But I think that shows us that there is a history for change. By the way, I am looking, if you do have questions, feel free to go to chat and post the questions. You can post them to the group or just to me, and I'll be following that, and I will be happy. You can interrupt at any point with questions, and I will be happy to acknowledge those questions as they appear. So far, I just have greetings, but I don't have a question yet, so feel free to post questions. Now, one of the most beloved texts of the Haggadah is the technical name is the Breita al Arbat Habanim, the Breita of the 4 sons, which in contemporary Haggadah we translate as the 4 children. But now, this is interestingly based upon based upon 4 verses in the Torah, 3 of which we were supposed to have read last Shabbat in the reading of Haggadah, that because of circumstance we were unable to read, and describing Pesach Mitzrayim, the first Passover that would be observed while the Israelites were still in Egypt. 3 of the verses came from that reading, and 1 from Deuteronomy. And each of these 4 verses in the Torah, and by the way, at some point, if anyone wants a copy of what a sheet that demarcates this very clearly, I'd be happy to make it available to you by email. Now, each of these verses anticipates that a child is going to ask a parent a question about the ritual of Pesach. And one of the questions is, again, the first 3 from the reading of Haggadah, supposed to have been read last Shabbat, is a rather detailed question about, what does this service mean to you? And then you give the answer. You tell them it's the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when he dealt the blow to Egypt, and our houses he rescued. People did homage and bowed low. That's the first verse that we read from. What is this worship to? What does this mean to you? And the second one is, and that, by the way, is attributed to the wicked son. We'll get back to that. The second question basically is not a question. It just says, "V'yigadat levincha," you shall tell your child on that day, saying, it's because of what God did for us when we left Egypt. The third verse, and that, by the way, because there's no question, is the ben she'eino l'yodea lishol. It's the child who's not able to ask, because the verse has no question. So we assume that child doesn't have the capability of asking the question. Okay. And then the third one is, should your child ask you tomorrow, mazot, what is this? Mazot, the 2-word question, what is this? What's going on? That's the Tam, the simple child. I apologize, in the Yerushalmi, it's the Tipesh. He's called the stupid child, but the Babylonian Talmud is a bit more sympathetic and says the simple child doesn't formulate a sophisticated question. 2 words. What's going on here? What is this? Mazot, 2 words in Hebrew. And the 4th one from Deuteronomy is a much more involved question, talking about edot, chukim, mishpatim, laws, statutes, ordinances. Because it's very detailed, it's attributed to the chacham, to the wise child. So, okay, that's basically under framework of what this Haggadah is about in the Talmud. What is this? What's going on here? So you have 4 verses, and the sages in Midrash starting off, and then in the Jerusalem Talmud, and finally taken into our Haggadah, extrapolate from these 4 verses. There are 4 different kinds of son, 4 different types of child. Okay, that we all know, that's famous. But what's fascinating is that, first of all, in the Torah, there is no moral qualification here. The child who says, what does this mean to you? That's not considered wicked. It's considered a good question. It's only the rabbis who decide to pose that against the other questions and say this child is not good because he's excluding himself. But what happens is fascinating, because if you look at the original versions of the Midrash in studying in the Mechilta, which is a halachic Midrash on the book of Exodus, that what they do something very radical, and that's copied in the Jerusalem Talmud. Now, what they do is, the problem we have is, we always say the wicked child is wicked because he or she says to you, and not including him or herself in the totality. But the verse we use for the wise son does exactly the same thing. Because the wise son's verse says, what are all these laws, statutes, and commandments? Asher tzivah Hashem Eloheinu etchem. What are all these laws, etc., that God has commanded you? So it's the same. There's no difference. The wise son is also saying you. He's not saying us. So why is he good and why is the other poor kid wicked? If he's doing the same thing the wise son is doing. So what the framers of the Midrash did, which is in a sense shocking, but it's really what happens in Midrash, is they changed the words of the verse. They changed the word. So the verse quoted in the Mechilta and in the Jerusalem Talmud goes like this: Maha Edot, etc. Asher Tziva Hashem Eloheinu Otanu. They change the word in the verse. They misquote the biblical verse and say, what are all these laws, commandments, and statutes that God has commanded us? But that's a misquote because the verse says that God has commanded you. The reason they did that is that they had to make it they had to make it polar opposite of what the wicked child would say, who's saying you instead of us. So here they misquote the verse. They change the word in the verse and say, what has God commanded, that God has commanded us, which is not what the verse says. But I have to say that what the problem with this, if you look at our Haggadah, I don't know who the first person who did this, but it's been copied through generations. The editor of the Haggadah that we use today screwed it up. Didn't understand the Midrash because he changed the verse back to the original. So it says, so if you look at our Haggadah, this Midrash, this four sons makes no sense. It absolutely makes no sense because you have the wise and the wicked son doing exactly the same thing, and one is not blamed for it. Only the wicked son is saying, you're wicked because you exclude yourself, but so does the wise son exclude yourself. The person who edited the Haggadah that we use now screwed up, didn't understand the Midrash, reformulated the verse back to its original form, and edited out the change and destroyed the Midrash. So, I mean, that's a great thing to talk about. What's the problem? Because the truth is, our printed Haggadah today, I saw one Haggadah in Israel where they actually went back to the original version and rechanged the words so it made sense. So you have to ask the question, what doesn't make sense here? Because there's no difference between the wise and the wicked son. So why is one wicked, why is one? They're both wicked, or they're both not wicked. So that's the fast. So the point I'm trying to talk about change, because there's going to be a lot of change in what we do this year. A much smaller seder. We're going to probably be forced to cut certain corners here and there because of the difficulty of doing all the arrangements. But change has authenticity because the earliest formulators of our Passover ritual would change a biblical verse to fit the purpose of the story they want to tell. So change is actually integral in the Passover experience. By the way, another great example, I'm looking to see if there are questions. Okay, Casman's want a copy, that's fine. So far, no questions. There's another great example of a liturgical change that nobody knows about. I shouldn't say nobody, there are 4 people in the world who know about, but it's not widely known. We said that you daven this morning, every morning in our prayer, we speak of God as Oseh Shalom Uvorei et HaKol, God who makes peace and is the creator of everything. It's a beautiful line, and it's a misquote of a verse from Isaiah. Go back to Isaiah. Isaiah describes God as Oseh Shalom Uvorei et Hara. God makes peace, and creates evil. Rather different, rather difficult. So the earliest editors of the Siddur, the earliest liturgists going back millennia ago, felt that the original wording was very difficult and edited out the word evil and replaced it with everything. They took out, so that's a classic example of change where the wording in a biblical verse is changed in order to satisfy a need. In the Haggadah, it's to satisfy a need to tell a story, to make a clash to try to create personality differences between children. And in the case of the morning service, to basically soften the language that would be very painful. We don't want to refer to God as creator of evil, but that's how the prophet refers to God, as the creator of evil. That's a that in itself is worth a 3-hour discussion. And maybe if you're looking for something to talk about at your seder, that is something that that can be discussed. I mean, in terms of the presence of evil in the world. I want to offer just something that occurred to me during our online service yesterday. That as I was listening and actually rather inspired, and Michael did a beautiful job. For those of you who were on the service, and I especially encourage you to come every morning, but especially Thursday morning, which is Rosh Chodesh, 8 a.m. We're going to do a really nice service, and I think you'll really enjoy it. But it occurred to me, there's a prayer that we have in our prayer book, in our Siddur, that is said on fast days, on minor fast days. And the truth is, I mean, if we're going to be honest about it, not a large percentage of our people fast on minor fast days. Only a relatively small percentage of the Orthodox community would fast, say, on some Gedalia the day after Rosh Hashanah. They say, who is Gedalia that I should fast for him? He was the governor of Judea and he was assassinated. He said, if I was killed, would he fast for me? So people don't fast. It's a whole genre of humor of why people don't fast on some Gedalia. And one of our former cantor, Mati Zingboim, who was, some of you remember from many years ago, or we had an Israeli cantor for 2 years, and he told me that the Israeli version of the joke was, well, I don't fast on Yom Kippur, why should I fast on some Gedalia? But so a lot of people don't fast on the minor fast days, but this prayer, but we still say the prayer in the morning service, and actually the prayer leader says it, not the congregation, but the prayer leader. But it's a gorgeous prayer that really fits today. And I'm just going to read to you, I'll read to you the opening, and it starts, Anenu, Hashem Anenu, answer us, God, answer us. The next 3 words I would leave out, the Yom Tzom Tanitenu, on this fast day, because it's not a fast day, but everything else makes perfect sense. I'll read you the English of this. It's an insertion in the Amidah that the prayer leader says, which actually I think would make sense to say at the Seder. Answer us, Lord, answer us. We are in great distress. Do not hide your face from us. Do not ignore our plea. Be near to our cry. Please let your loving kindness comfort us. Even before we call to you, answer us, as it is said. Before they call, I will answer. While they are still speaking, I will hear. For you, Lord, are the one who answers in time of distress, redeems and rescues in all times of trouble and anguish. Blessed are you, Lord, who answers in time of distress. In the Hebrew, Baruch Atah Hashem, ha'oneh be'et tzara. And if anyone wants, I would be happy to send a copy of that text to anyone who wants. So I would put that right after the halach ma'ani at the beginning of the Seder. This is the bread of affliction, and just adding that paragraph, which is very powerful. And again, it doesn't really resonate, when we say in the congregation, and to be honest, most people aren't really fasting. We don't have breakfast in shul. The late Rabbi Pappenheim used to joke that he said to me privately, he didn't say it publicly, so I ask his forgiveness for saying it publicly. But when we had a minor fast day, he would say, this minor fast day means we go home for breakfast, we don't have it in shul. But we don't, it doesn't really resonate in the same sense, but here it resonates. I think it really resonates now in terms of feeling a need to express some of the anguish of the current scene, and that's one example that would fit perfectly into the Haggadah. So I'm looking to see if there are any questions. Brenda, I thank you for your comment about how your personal loss has enabled you to deal with change, and I think that's something that life often teaches us in terms of finding this year where change is forced upon us. But as I hope I pointed out to you, that there is an authenticity to change that really is part of our tradition, even in relatively good times or in fine dining. We're okay with changing a biblical word to tell a story or to soften the blow of something that's very painful. There are times where change is essential in order to fulfill the needs of the human condition. And that, again, is certainly the agenda this year. Now, okay, I'm not seeing any questions at this point. But if there are any, please again post questions in the chat function on Zoom, should you have any, and I will be happy to get to them. What I will try when I finish, I will unmute all of you, but it's going to be difficult because it's hard to recognize. But if someone has a question they want to ask orally, I will give you that opportunity. A couple of other things I want to go through, and one is the reality that this year seders are going to be small. Like sometimes really small. You know, I'm talking to people who normally have 30 people who are down to 2. So I began by saying that, you know, as long as you're comfortable with it, use technology to include people at a distance. It's hard if you have kids in Israel because there's going to be a 7-hour time lag. It's right now 6 hours, but it's going to go back to 7 hours next week. So that's hard. But if you're in the same time zone or reasonably close time zones, you can do it. And so use tech. But what happened? What does our tradition say about when you have a very small seder? So we're all familiar with the what we call, you know, the 4 questions, which is basically a misnomer because it's only one question. The question is, Manish Tana Halai, why is this night different from all other nights? You all know the jokes about the queen knighting, etc. But so why? That's the only question, and then you get 4 examples of why this night is different. So it's one question with 4 proof texts as to why this night is different. And over time, and I'm not going to go into it now, I've done it in some other classes. This changes through the generations. The proof that the earliest versions are different than the contemporary version because circumstances changed, and so the examples given are not always the same as they are now. But the interesting part is, so what I want to focus on now is not that aspect, but the Mishnah begins by saying, the second cup of wine is poured, v'kan haben shoel aviv, and here the child asks the father, v'imen dat beven aviv milamdo, and if the child does not have the intellectual capability of asking, the father prompts him. And what's interesting is what follows in the Mishnah is the Manish Tana Halalazem, Kol Halelot, etc., what we call the 4 questions, which was never intended to be a ritual, was never intended to be a liturgical recitation. The text here was given as a suggestion to the father as to how you could prompt your son who doesn't know what to ask. So it's basically, but it was never intended to be, the intent was not that it be a ritualized question, rather that the child would ask something spontaneously because of the weird things that were happening at the Seder table. And that was, that's why you poured the second cup of wine. And that's a very important instruction in the Haggadah. And you forget about it because you didn't finish all the wine from the Kiddush, so you still have wine. You don't bother refilling. You got to refill the second cup of wine before the 4 questions, because that's supposed to provoke the question as to why are you pouring the wine now? Because you don't pour the second cup of wine until after we've eaten. We haven't had dinner yet. You forgot dinner. What happened? We didn't eat. We just said a few prayers. We ate a piece of lettuce. We didn't do anything. Why are you asking? Why are we pouring the second cup of wine? We forgot dinner. And then you say, you want to know why this night is different? And then you tell the whole story of the Exodus. But so that's why you do other things. There are all kinds of weird stories that people would do. They take away the table. And why are you taking away the table? Okay, I'll tell you why I'm taking the table. I'm taking away the table because, instead I would just be taking the Seder plate away, but doing weird things, doing crazy things for a child to say, why are you doing crazy things? I'll tell you why I'm doing crazy things. And then you tell the story. So the Manish Tana was a last resort if the kid was oblivious. And we know sometimes children can be oblivious. We've seen that in our own family histories. Sometimes because you can do all this stuff and they're not paying attention. They're just not aware. They're not caring. It's like I used to compare this to when I ride on the New York subway when I was a student in New York, and people would do all these really bizarre things that no one looks. Nobody cares. You're oblivious because you just know that weird things are going to happen and you don't care. So if you have a child that's oblivious to what's going on, doesn't notice the changes, then okay, here's a text you could use. But what happened was, by the time of the Talmud, a couple of hundred years later, fourth, fifth century, that text becomes beloved in and of itself. And even though it was not intended by the author of the Mishnah to become a ritualized questioning, that's what it became. So it was no longer inviting the spontaneous question, but the specific question ritualized as manish tana halayla zem mikol haleilot, with very nice melodies, etc. So that's what happens. Okay, but that I don't want to talk about that today, even though I've spent the last 10 minutes talking about it. What I want to talk about is what the Talmud says in response. So the Mishnah says, if you don't, very simply, if the child he doesn't have ability to ask, you prompt him, etc. You encourage the question. Fine, that's all the Mishnah says. But the Talmud then takes it further. The Talmud, in reacting to this Mishnah, says the following: Chacham beno, if the child is smart, shoalo, he will ask the question. V'imeno chacham, if he's not so smart, ishto shoalto. Then, excuse me, this is not the most egalitarian text in our history. And then the Talmud says, if the child is not going to ask the question, his wife can ask the question. Sorry, again, it's not gender sensitive. It's not terribly gender sensitive. And then imlav, if she's not going to ask the question, hu shoel atzmo, he asks himself the question. And he starts talking to himself. I do that a lot. And but then it goes on to say in the Talmud, this is really what's powerful. Afilu shnei talmidei chachamim shiodin b'hilchot, even if the seder consists of two sages, two scholars who are well versed in the laws of Passover, sholin zeh lazeh, they ask each other the questions. So what it is saying here is the questions. It doesn't mean you may have a seder where there's no child, or where the youngest person at the seder is 84. We're going to be reduced to small sedarim. There won't be a 4-year-old necessarily in front of you. Maybe there'll be one virtually who can ask the questions. That will be amazing. But if not, you still ask the questions of yourself, if you're one person, two people, two senior citizens, or whoever, two people who will really know it's still a requirement that you ask, because part of the dynamic of Jewish survival is asking questions, is being concerned, wanting to learn out of everything that happens in life, wanting to really take every point seriously, and not leaving things to the imagination. So the Talmud says here very powerfully, okay, theoretically, the child's going to ask, but if that doesn't work, so the man is sitting with his wife will ask. So again, I'm sorry that it sort of makes implications about a woman being not equal to a man. And you're looking at 2,000 years ago, so we're a little forgiving of that lapse of egalitarianism. But then it says that two scholars, they ask each other. Or you by yourself, you ask yourself. It's great for those of us who talk to ourselves. We're addressed that. We have a reason now not to feel guilty about asking ourselves. So that's basically the idea of, in a solitary seder, if you're down to the minimal number of people, there's still something you can do. There's still something you can do. And our tradition recognizes that not every seder is going to be 40 people around a large table. There are going to be historical circumstances. There are going to be challenging circumstances that are going to require us to modify, but still we do what we have to do, even if it's at the most individual level. So it doesn't take away from the experience. It doesn't take away the experience of the Seder, it modifies it. Again, going back to change required by circumstance. Okay, the final point that I'm going to raise, and then I will unmute you, is the fact that there are examples of seders that were recited at very challenging moments of history. I have a few. I'm just gonna. I can't really. I can hold this up. You're not gonna see. Well, you can see it. You can see it if you're looking at my picture. One is called the Gur's Haggadah, which was put up by Rabbi Scheim. It is a reprint of a Haggadah that was basically that was written in 1941 in France in a detention camp in a place called Gurs in southwestern France, and it basically it's a handwritten Haggadah. You can get a sense of what it looks like. I mean, a very minimal sense, but it will, for example, talk about the horrors of what was happening during this time, what it was, the tragedy that the Jewish people was experiencing, and re-examining the whole seder experience based on the contemporary circumstance. So I mention this to basically remind us of the fact that we have records of sederim that took place during very, very adverse historical moments, and and commenting on the fact that even though we're in a very, very great moment of distress, we don't lose hope for the redemption of the Jewish people. And a similar Haggadah that was based on a Haggadah text that was written in a DP camp in 1946 in Germany. And in a sense, this has a very strong Zionist bent, that we're still furious with God and with what happened and how we were abused. It basically takes the traditional text and contemporizes it in describing the horrific circumstances of those war years. And again, this is a survivor's Haggadah. It's called the survivor's Haggadah. And but basically also saying that history will be rectified because we're going to end up in Israel. That's where our goal is going to be. We're going to build a Jewish state, and we're going to have a homeland, and we're going to have a glorious future, even though we've just come out of hell. So, I mean, it is totally wrong to compare what we're undergoing now to the Shoah. Of course, it would be an absurd comparison, but it does suggest that we've had to have sedarim in challenging moments throughout our history, much more challenging than what we're experiencing now, and we didn't lose hope for a better future. And that sort of gives us the determination to cope with the inconveniences and the sadness of not being together as families, etc., but knowing that that will change. We'll go back to what we want, and we still have a strong future as a people. It was 40 years ago that I experienced the seders in the Soviet Union, and where I'll never forget what it was like to say, Avadim hayinu leFaro, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, sitting at a table with Jews who were enslaved, as unable to leave for Israel, prisoner, in a sense, held prisoner in their country, suffering great persecution, and having to do a seder, learning Hebrew, all of it under the table in hiding because it was violating the laws of their country. So we've and we came out of those times, and remember, but there's a lot of history that we have, painful history, but telling us that we've been through tough times before, and Gamze Ya'avor, that the relatively minor challenges of the present, everybody should be healthy, will at some point be overcome. And we will get back to full strength observance of our rituals. And we have Israel today, so it's a very different world. And we know that there are better times ahead. So with that said and done, I am going to unmute all of you. Now, hopefully won't hear too much distraction. If anybody wants to make a comment or ask a question out loud, none of you ask questions in writing, and I will be happy to. There is a way of, if you don't want to ask anything or say anything, you may want to mute yourselves privately, especially if you have a lot of background noise. But if anybody wants to ask a question on anything I said or offer a comment, there is a way of raising your hand or just if I'm not sure that will be visible. I see a hand. Anna has a hand up. Okay, Anna, go ahead.
I have a question on the chat. I said, why isn't the question regarding the wise son changed back again to say us instead of you?
I'm sorry, and I'm not getting the question broke up. I couldn't really understand it.
Oh, well, I have it on the chat. If you can look on the chat.
I'm looking at it now. Oh, I see. I missed it. Oh, I see.
Yes, statement.
Oh, okay. Got it. Thank you. I told you to use this, and I forgot that I had to look up on it. Okay. The question is, why isn't the question regarding the wise son changed back again to say us? Well, it has happened in a couple of Israeli Haggadot that I've seen, but by and large, I think a lot of people have not noticed this, or not. The problem becomes that we look at the Haggadah too much as a ritualized text, and we forget that it's a dynamic document, that it's supposed to really reflect something that we react to. And you're reading it as ritualized text, you're not paying attention, or you're reading it in translation, you're skipping through it quickly and not really focusing. But here it's really phenomenal to focus on the language, understand what they're doing is taking 4 biblical verses and trying to create a story out of these 4 biblical verses, but people don't pay close enough attention. It should be changed to us. It has in some, but very few versions. Most haven't changed it, like the Goldberg one that's you can get for $2 at Costco if you can get into Costco. Everybody, those are they didn't go back to say us, which they should have. So they should, and they haven't, and I think they should. So I'm looking at seeing if there are other questions now that I noticed a bunch of questions. In this, okay. Someone asked me in the seder for 2 who asked the 4 questions. I think I've answered that in the discussion. The Talmud tells us, even ask yourself if you have to. Okay, I think that's about. So any other live questions, comments?
What's up?
Oh, hello.
I hear a hello.
Okay.
To get to Rabbi Scheim?
Oh.
Yes. What you're speaking about? What? What do you do with what?
Okay, I'm not sure I'm understanding that.
I see what you mean. Yeah, that's a good question. I'm listening to this shiur in Toronto, and so is.
I don't know.
There he is, Lionel.
This is the problem with
other parts of the world. That's pretty cool. I'm going to be on the phone with Europe in about an hour. So now we've, I don't know, it's great that we're hearing from other. So anyone have a question that, again, it's hard to recognize, even though there's a mechanism for raising your hand, but there's so many of us.
Rabbi?
Okay, yes.
I used to read a 5th child, the child who could not speak, which was the child of the Shoah.
That's very powerful. I mean, there have been various forms of the 5th child. That's one that's very powerful. I think that's beautiful to do, because we have to commemorate those who we lost in the Shoah all the time. There's also a 5th child in some versions who's the one who's not at the table.
That's the one I refer to.
No, but the one who's not at the table, not because he was murdered in the Shoah, but because he doesn't want to be doesn't even want to be there, doesn't respond to the invitation. He's alive and he's just not bothering to attend the seder.
Okay.
This year, unfortunately, there'll be people who won't be at the table, but not because they don't want to be at the table, because of circumstance. But there have been a lot contemporary rewrites of the 4 children that are, there's a very powerful rewrite of it in the New American Haggadah, which is a bit radical and crazy. There's also an Israeli version of that, which is interesting, where they try to contemporize the reality of the 4 children. So that's been a very dramatic text. But again, I just wanted to look at the point of view of how the text has been modified and then unmodified in order to attempt to tell a story. Any other questions or comments?
I wrote a comment in the web chat about the Haggadah, A Different Night. Are you familiar with that Haggadah?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the 400 that I have. The Noam Goodman. What's not Noam Goodman? Noam.
Hello.
So it basically covers, I think, the topic that we're discussing about the 4 questions, and it really demonstrates how beautiful and how simple and how unobtrusive it can be for these 4 questions to be asked by almost anybody sitting at the seder.
Okay.
Hello.
Yes, Stephen?
Yes, Rabbi. I've asked everybody in a text to please mute your microphones because there's a lot of background feeding noise that's interfering with the
Shikoyach.
discussion. So please tap your own name, and on the bottom left it'll say mute. Mute your microphone unless you're going to contribute.
Good point. Thank you.
Hello.
If I can suggest, you can mute everybody's microphone, and if they want to talk, they just press the space bar on their computer keyboard, and that will give them an opportunity to
Okay,
talk.
so I did that before, so I'll unmute all of you. I'll mute all of you, but you can unmute yourself if you want to ask something.
Okay, Rabbi, it's Marion. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
I'm one person. What is my obligation?
He said to
But,
Later, I'm going to try to tune into Linda, but I have no idea what I'm going to do. The first time in my life.
that's again what I was referring to. You're going to do the best you can. If you can tune into Linda, do that. Hopefully you can. I mean, you're on now, so you are computer savvy enough to be on. So find a way to tune into to Linda, and do it. But that's again, you're muted, Marion. No. Okay, you're muted. So Marion, we're not hearing you because you're muted.
Oh, okay.
Okay, but you do the best you can, but try to link in if you can. Otherwise, you just go through the Haggadah. I mean, you do whatever you can do yourself. It's sad, it's hard, it's depressing, but use whatever you can to try to connect. If that's going to be possible, it should be possible. Any other questions?
Rabbi, it's
Yes.
Steve Kraft here. Can
Hi, Steve.
you I remember you once gave us a shiur where you talked about the various traditions about the 4 questions that were at one time 5, at one time 3.
Correct.
And just the references in the Gemara. I mean, just thought the others might be interested because that was a really interesting, again, variations in tradition over many years, and just when the changes were made to the 4 from those original sources.
Well, there is I can't necessarily give you the years, but I don't have it in front of me, but I'll just do from memory, that the Jerusalem Talmud, which is probably the oldest version that we have, has 3, I'm using the word questions because that's popular, even though it's basically 3 proofs of the question. And then Maimonides, I believe, has 5. I'm doing this from memory, not in front of me. But the most average became 4. Like the Babylonian Talmud made it 4. If anybody's interested, I might post some of this on our website. I have a chart showing the various versions of the questions and how they evolved. So you have basically the earliest versions. These are all going back 2,000 plus years. The Babylonian Mishnah is the second oldest. The Jerusalem version is the first oldest. Again, it wasn't really, and it was the question, because it's basically the Mishnah says the child asks the father a question, and the question is, why is this night different from all other nights? And then he gives evidence as to what he's seen to make this night different. But I can provide, those who wanted, the chart that I would have given out when I taught this in person, which is showing how there are, the various versions that we have before us. It kind of, in the last couple of 100 years, it's kind of been stabilized and pretty well a standard version. The Sephardim have a different version, different order than the Ashkenazim, but basically it's the same text. That has been, but for a long period of time over, there were differences of when reality changed. Give you one example of reality changing. We have one of the questions is about dipping, that says every other night, in the original version in the Mishnah, every other night we dip once, tonight twice. But by the Talmudic time, 300 years later, the version changed to on every other night we do not even dip once. That's our version. Tonight twice. What happened here? That in the Roman times, when the seder originates, the custom was at every banquet to dip a vegetable into a solid into a liquid. Like imagine you're dipping a piece of celery into a salad dressing, into some kind of dip. That was customary at every banquet. It was what you did at a banquet. So that was the custom of the time when the seder originated. And so the question was, yeah, we always dipped once at a meal, but what was going to make tonight different was you're going to dip twice. You're going to dip the vegetable into the salt water, the karpas, and then you're going to dip the maror into the charoset. So you're having a second dipping, and that's the child's supposed to say, wow, this is cool. Why are we dipping twice? We only normally dip once. But the Roman custom kind of vanished by the Talmudic period. They didn't do that anymore. No one knew from dipping once. So they changed it. We don't even dip once anymore, tonight twice. So it reflects the dynamism of history. But what's fascinating is that there would have been a cleaner way of doing this. Say every other night we don't dip, tonight we dip. Didn't matter once, twice, or 11 times. If you normally don't do it, now you're doing it. That's what matters. But we like making the minimal number of changes. So all they did is added the word ein and a filu, 2 words to the original. Then instead of saying every other night we dip once, every other night we don't even dip once. They wanted to minimalize the change in the text because we don't like doing you don't want to do radical change. So in Hebrew, you're adding 2 words, ein and a filu. It's a few more words in English, but that's an example of how in history this changes, and that version remains for centuries the version now because we didn't revert to dipping again. But so it does reflect a historical transition because it was supposed to be real reaction to, and then the question about reclining, and and other questions that, an example of things that made this night unusual because basically everybody conducted him or herself at the Seder as a free person in Roman imagery. And people who were free would eat lying down. If you were a gvir, you were an important person in Roman times, you would eat your meal lying down. Doctors will say today, not a great idea, but that's what they used to do. And if you were a poor schlepper, you would have to be sitting. So normally we're all schleppers, we're sitting, but when you're really a free person, you're a big shot, you would eat lying down. Of course, that's not a great idea. Medically, it's not better to do sitting and not lying down. But in Roman times, it wasn't good. You look at the Roman, I haven't seen Ben-Hur for a long time, like the original Ben-Hur. But I suspected they're having a banquet. They're sprawled out eating the banquet, and the slaves are feeding them, and they're lying down like big, important people. But that's what we all did at the Seder. So now the reclining became ritualized to just leaning on a pillow or something, but not mamash. Originally, it was lying down, like you were in bed with a pillow. And so that was the idea, of demonstrating that we're free. And that was everybody became free. It wasn't just the wealthy or the people at the elite of society, but it was everybody. That loses its thrust, of course, because that image no longer, unless you watch Ben-Hur, that image doesn't exist anymore. In our consciousness, people don't do that anymore. But it was reflective from the time when this was created. And they were, in a sense, trying to make a point and saying, well, we're all free people now. Again, the customs that originate the Seder basically originates in the Roman period. So it's not in the Egyptian period. I mean, basically, it's in the Roman period. The first Haggadah come out of that period. And then it becomes like everything else, embellished and and also reflecting changes in history. Any other? Maybe we have time for one more question.
Rabbi, I'm confused between holidays here. I seem to remember that it's either Purim or Pesach, that if you can't celebrate it on the month that it's supposed to be, you can do it the following month. Which is it?
Well, you're definitely talking about Pesach because Purim is not a major holiday.
So it
Purim
must
is
be
not.
Pesach.
It's definitely Pesach, and there is something. It's a very good question. There is something called Pesach Sheni,
Yes,
which
that's
take
the
place the 15th of Nisan, a month later. No, sorry, of ER. Sorry, the 15th, which is a month later from the 15th of Nisan, the first day of Pesach. And the idea was if you weren't in a state of ritual purity, so you couldn't bring the Passover sacrifice on the right day, you could bring it a month later. People have discussed that. It's a very good question because people have actually said, if we can't do proper seders, should we maybe reinstate Pesach Sheni and have people do seders then? The unfortunate reality is probably not going to make a difference to 1 month. Who knows? We don't know the timing. I wish it will. I hope it will. but hard to say. I'm dealing with people who are postponing May weddings to October, November, or beyond, because May is already too close to plan a simcha. So I don't think it would work in this case. Unfortunately, I hope I'm wrong. But that was the concept, that if you weren't able to observe the Passover in its right time, and in the Torah, what is observing Pesach? It was bringing a sacrifice and eating matzah and eating maror, a few things, but it wasn't sitting down to a Haggadah and having a catered meal. It was, but that was a very good comment, because there was that idea of postponement. And at the early stages of this crisis, people suggested that we should reinstate Pesach Sheni. The problem is, again, I don't think that's realistic at this point, because 1 month is not going to give us the time that we'll need to get back to a sense of normalcy. We hope it will be soon, but we also have to be realistic. So we're almost at the 1 hour mark. If there's one other quick question, I will take it. And otherwise, we will continue next week. And you can also email me questions between now and next week, if you want to. And I'm going to try to have a handout ready that can be available, that you can download for next week. If I'm going to try to. I'm not promising, but I'm going to try to do that for next week. So meanwhile, I don't see. Is there a question? I see a hand.
I have a question to something that you just mentioned, weddings being postponed.
Yeah.
We've seen that happen. We've got an invitation that way. I was told by Rabbi Pappenheim that you must not postpone a wedding. You move it forward, but never postpone.
Well, if you're moving it forward, it's not postponed.
Closer. In other words, instead of
I think
move it 13.
You normally don't want to do it, but the reality is such that if you're having, you want to have who wants to have a wedding with 10 people? There are places now in Europe where you're not allowed to congregate in groups larger than 2.
Okay.
So you can have a bride and groom at a wedding, and you can't have an officiant. So it's not practical. It's just a person. So it's because of the time. It's the restrictions that this crisis imposes upon us that make, ideally, you don't postpone. You don't postpone just because you decide, but this is different. I mean, we've never experienced this before. So you have to, realistically, unless you want, maybe now you can have a minion present at your wedding if they're all 2 meters apart, and you find a place where you can host it. But not everyone wants to do that. I've families that have 300 people weddings planned, and they totally abandon that and just get married privately. There was this Israeli couple that got married in a grocery store, because at that point they were allowed to bring a lot of people into. They can't do that now. It's just virtually impossible to have a wedding the way you'd want to have a wedding. Some people who just want to get married will get married privately, but in this case, one would say, if I'm going to be really blunt about it and reflecting 2020 reality, I would say that a sizable percentage of the people who I will be marrying are already living together. I mean, that's a reality we all know. It's not a shock anymore. It's a shock when people aren't living together before they get married. And so what's going to change if they delay the wedding 5 months, 4 months? Nothing. I mean, the fact is, you want to be able to celebrate with your family. You don't want to have people on Zoom attending your wedding. So, nobody is saying, that you can't do it under the circumstance, because you cannot have, I mean, even if you want to look at halacha, halacha requires a minyan present for a wedding to take place. A wedding requires a minyan, and that in many circumstances, or most, is not even possible today. Maybe the bare minimum is 10, and if you just can do with nobody else there, but that's going to change. 10 is going to be too large a gathering soon.
Yeah, that's right.
There's been places that already has changed. So it's going to be impossible to have a halachic wedding. And so I think anyone is going to say, in an ideal circumstance, better, it's supposed to postpone, but there are times where life, where things happen that you have to deal with it. You have to respond to a crisis and be, sensible and achieve your ultimate goal. So it's painful, but there are a lot of, and these are not easy decisions. I have 3 weddings that I'm supposed to be doing that people are still deciding whether or not to postpone, but the not postponing is a very difficult alternative, frankly. So I don't think anyone is going to say you can't postpone today. That was a different time. So I'm really strict about not going beyond the hour, because I think Zoom will vanish or something will happen to us. We go beyond the hour. But I want to thank all of you. We are going to continue 1 week from now, same time, same station. We'll continue to send your questions, and I'll be happy to respond to them. Email me the questions, rabbi@bethdavid.com, and I will try to answer all of them next week when we begin and take this 1 week further. Okay? Toda rabah to all of you.
Thank you.
Stay safe, stay well, and join us for davening and join all of the other classes we're offering. Thank you, Rabbi Walker, for making this possible, and thank you all of you for participating.
Thank you, Rabbi.
And,
Thank you.
be well.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.